just so thankful for what we've done. But this leads to another story.
Well, I want to hear that, but what about the Mentor Foundation?
Oh,
Can you
yeah.
Okay.
When I was working with WHO, we were working on high-risk youth and at-risk children and youth in developing countries, and the main focus was on drug use. And as the World Health Organization began to defund the program, in that very year they had invited the Queen of Sweden to come and address the annual health meeting. They pull in all the donor countries once a year and give them a report on what the World Health Organizations had done with their country's money. And the Queen of Sweden was there, and she was to give the keynote address. And she heard this report about the children in these developing countries you know, suffering from homelessness and suffering from malnutrition and suffering from drug use, usually inhaled drug use, the inhalants. And she was very moved by it. She's a very sensitive person. She was very moved by it. And so she went back and she talked to some of her colleagues, and they decided that they were going to develop, for the first time in the World Health Organization's history, a collaborative foundation that would work under the rubric of the World Health Organization and what they were calling the Mentor Foundation. And they used the word mentor because they wanted to create the concept of not mentoring young people, but to create the environment. If you remember, Mentor's story was he was Ulysses' best friend. And when Ulysses went off to war, he turned to his best friend Mentor and said, you know, could you take care of my son? Because, you know, a woman cannot raise a boy. Okay, I mean, this was in Greek mythology. A woman cannot raise a boy. You need a male to raise a boy. And he says, well, I'm a single man, but I don't know. I'll do it just because you're my buddy. So off he goes to war, and of course, Mentor is there to raise this boy. And so he doesn't know what to do, so he goes off to, what was the source of all knowledge in Greek mythology?
Olympus? Or
Oh, yeah, he goes off. Yeah. And he says, he asked the question, what should I do? And the answer was, create an environment which brings out the best in the individual. And that's where the word mentor comes from. It's not what you would tell, but it's the environment that you create. And so he said, I can do that, and he created that. So they called themselves the Mentor Foundation because they knew that they could not go into countries and tell them what to do. They're going to try and create comfortable environments in which these young people could then have a better life. Well, what happened was that the Mentor Foundation separated from World Health. They asked some people at World Health, you know, could you recommend some technical advisors? And so they recommended me to be one of their technical advisors to Mentor. Now, you got to remember that this is kings and queens and princesses and big businessmen, HMM, the guy who owns H&M, you know, all these big people. So they're having their meetings in castles and palaces. Yeah? And here I am there, you know, remember, blue-collar worker, growing up, didn't know what medicine was all about. I'm now sitting in palaces, you know, and you know, people come out with white gloves. I remember the guy in the palace in Copenhagen. The waiter came up, he had an aperitif in each one of these fingers and one here. He had 4 aperitifs, all bottles open. And he had white gloves on, and he was, Monsieur. And he said, what would you like to drink? I didn't know what he would have there. I said, you know, I just pointed at that one. He'd pour that one. The other one wouldn't pour. He had a way of doing it all. You know, and so now I'm hanging out with royalty. Yeah. So but again, you know, carrying that message, and what I added to their sort of mission was the concept that you can't deal with dysfunction unless you really understand development and function. And so they added to their mission promoting healthy development amongst children and adolescents. And that allows them to be the mentors to that. And so that's how and you know, the Mentor Foundation has now got, you know, programs all around the world. They've created these programs. They have them in South America. They have them in some of the developed countries. And they're growing their mentor family. And we still meet. And the king and queen and I are on first name basis. Oh, good to see you again, Dick. But that led me to and I know we're running out of time.
No, we're fine.
Okay.
No, we're fine.
That led me to as some people know, I got involved in Mongolia. And again, yes, you know, 1991 Mongolia, just a little background, 1991 Mongolia, before 1991 Mongolia was part of the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1990-91, several countries didn't know what to do. Mongolia decided it was going to become a democracy, an emerging democracy. It was. But again, you have to understand that Mongolia has been a closed country for over 400 years, first with the Chinese and then with the Russians. And they've been a very peaceful country, very Tibetan in its view. It's not part of Tibet, but very Buddhist in its view. But the Chinese and the Russians made sure they killed off most of the Buddhist priests because they were counter philosophies to what their philosophy was. So, I think at one time, 80% of the men in Mongolia were Buddhist priests, and they got killed off. They were just mass graves and killed off. So in 1991, this country opens up. Unbeknownst to me, a history professor from Cal State Long Beach is fascinated by the Soviet Union, fascinated by the history of Mongolia, and decides when it opens up, he's going to go and visit. So he goes over and visits. I don't know this guy. And so he goes over and visits. And when he's there, he is intrigued by the dilemma of the medical care for young people, and mainly children. He was intrigued by the lack of medical care and the poor medical. He's not a doctor. He's a PhD in Russian history. So he comes back, and while he was over there, just a little side, he was a community activist, and he and three of his friends had brought a lawsuit against one of the builders, the developers in Venice, California, for building a building too high. And because there was a 30-foot limit, and they had built it 34 feet or something. And so they wanted to maintain the sort of little town feel of Venice, California. So they brought this lawsuit. Anyway, to make a long story short, they won the lawsuit, but he was in Mongolia when they won the lawsuit. And he had a very Buddhist philosophy about him. And so when they called him and told him that they had won the lawsuit and he got $1 million from that lawsuit, that the only reason why they had won it, because he was in Mongolia and they kept his mouth shut while he was over there. So he was in Mongolia, and so he thought, oh my golly, Buddhists, this is sort of something that is meant to happen. So he's going to take the $1 million, and when he saw these poor children, he was going to dedicate it to improving the lot of the poor children of Mongolia. And knows diddly squat about medicine. Comes back and picks up the phone, calls the operator, and just tells the story to the operator. I just came back from Mongolia. I'm a Russian history professor, and I'm looking for a doctor to help me, and blah. Tells this whole story. I could just hear the operator going, what the hell is this guy talking about? He had just the ability to talk, and I don't think the operator could hang up on him. Finally, after about a half an hour, she says, I'll connect you with the LA County Medical Association. Calls and connects him with the LA County Medical Association, and the receptionist takes the call and says, oh, you got to talk to our PR guy. PR guy is the guy who sent me to China. Oh, you got to talk to Dick MacKenzie over at Children's Hospital. So he gets on the phone, and then we're talking for like an hour on the phone, telling me his story of all this, and I'm fascinated by it because I'd never had such an exotic experience. And he says, can you go to Mongolia? Well, he said, what should I do? I said, I don't know. I don't even know anything about Mongolia. I said, I've got to go there to find out what the conditions are. He says, well, I can go anytime. And I said, well, I'm going to be in Guangzhou. He says, I'll meet you in Beijing. We'll fly over to Mongolia together, Ulaanbaatar. Never met the guy. So he said, I'll make all the arrangements. So I said, fine. So, I mean, I'm used to going to Guangzhou where I have English people there to talk to. I end up going up to Beijing. I'm picked up at the airport by one of these pirate cab drivers. And he says, where are you going? And I gave him the name of the hotel. And he takes me to the hotel, way off the beaten track, beautiful little hotel. No one in the hotel speaks a word of English. So I walk in, and I said, Dr. MacKenzie. No, Dr. MacKenzie. And I said, no, Dr. MacKenzie. So I said, show me the registry. And he's looking, no. I flip it. It's all in Chinese. I have no idea what it says. So finally I keep saying, no, I have a place. And finally he gets the message. So he gives me a room, and I go upstairs to the room, and I lie down after the long trip. And I says, before I went upstairs, I says, I'm supposed to meet a Dr. Springer here. Oh, no, Dr. Springer. No, Dr. Springer. I said, no, I'm meeting. You're going to come through the door, Dr. Springer. Here. He says, no, Dr. Springer. I said, okay, I'm out. So I go up to the room, and I call down, and I says, has Dr. Springer arrived? No, Dr. Springer. No, Dr. Springer. So I said, oh, dear, maybe I'm in the wrong hotel because I had this pirate cab driver. I had no idea. I just gave him the note that I was told to give him. So this happens 3 times. No, Dr. Springer. No, Dr. Springer. So finally, I'm getting anxious. And what am I going to do? I'm in the middle of Beijing. I don't know. I can't communicate with anybody. Then the phone rings. Ring, 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 ring. Pick it up. Dr. Springer, Dr. Springer, Dr. Springer. I said, oh, my God, what's going on? So I come down there. Here is Dr. Springer, the Russian history professor, a total transvestite. Long white hair, ribbons in his hair, long cocktail gloves on, you know, long cocktail dress, cowboy boots, you know, necklace, you know. And the guy's going, Dr. Springer, Dr. Springer. And that was my introduction to Mongolia. Now, this man was a true transvestite. He wore those clothes all the time, even when he was teaching at Cal State Long Beach. And he's the most wonderful man you'd ever want to meet. And it sort of teaches you the lesson that you have to look beyond the presentation and look at the individual. And I felt cool with it. I was just like, it just caught me by surprise because by this, you know, I mean, you know, in our high-risk youth work, you get to meet everybody. I remember when I first started working with the free clinic, I turned to a young lady and we were sitting like in a room and there was people getting registered over here. And I said, well, could you take your clothes off and get up on the table? And she just took all her clothes off in the middle of nowhere. And I said, hold it now. Well, let me pull a curtain around or something. You know? So anyway, we go over to Mongolia and we're walking across Ukbatar Square, which is the main square of Ulaanbaatar. And you know, I'm fascinated because they're all wearing their dells, their long clothes, and their little hats, you know, because this is a country that's coming out of 400 years of being behind a curtain. And very few Westerners have been in there. And you know, they all got their hero medals on, you know, from the Russian regime. Remember, we used to always kid people at that, the hero for this. You'd get a hero for cooking dinner and things like that. And they all had their hero medals on. And I was staring at them, and they were all staring at Dr. Springer. And I thought, wow, you know, I can understand why but they were staring for a different reason, because they thought Dr. Springer was a shaman. You see, a shaman has their power, as I've learned over time. The shaman has their power in their ritual and their words and their clothes. So people wanted to come up and touch Dr. Springer's clothes because they were full of the spirit of the shaman. And so people were coming up, and they would look at me like I was some kind of freak, because I was with the shaman, and I was a Westerner with the shaman, and they'd come up and look at me as almost to get permission from me if they can touch his clothes. And I was like, I don't know. I mean, I just met him myself.
He looked normal.
So anyway, they take us off to our digs for the evening, which is, they take us out to the countryside and put us in this ger, this octagonal tent that Mongolians live in. And there's 2 beds in a ger, like this, and so I got this bed and he's got that bed. And so he travels with these cases rather than with valises. He has these sort of plastic things you buy from Home Depot, and that's his suitcase. And I've got mine, and so I unpack mine very quickly, and he starts unpacking, and he's hanging up this dress, he's hanging up that dress, and I'm looking over like he's got this dress, his little brassiere goes over the top of the dress, you know? and then he reaches down and he pulls out a bunch of magazines, and he throws them on the head of my bed, the little table at the head of my bed. And I'm sitting there, well, I'm old, so I reach over and grab a magazine, and they're all Victoria's Secret catalogs.